people get in trouble? I mean, everybody knows it's the same day every year. I know that, I have my pile of tax forms piling up without actually have done much with them. But how do people get in trouble? What's that first step that you can just see people traveling the wrong path?
Ben, it's actually more common than people think. I've actually done workshops with people, like a group of realtors and something, and found almost 1 in 4 have something going on. I mean, that's a staggering number when you think about it. I've stopped kind of judging the situation, but what I find is usually there's a story behind it. So
always a story, John. Yeah, so always a story.
Somebody got sick. Maybe somebody lost a job. I saw one situation where a guy's family member got into drugs, so he literally put the family member in a car and came across the country and left all his business records on the other side of the country. So you never know what happens, but usually it's some element of adversity in their lives that just causes them to take the eye off the ball.
Well, you talk about, you pay taxes, but tax returns are also expensive to get done. Do you run into people who just can't afford to get their taxes done? It seems kind of like a silly thing, but...
Right. Well, there is help sometimes if you can't afford to do it for at least the lower income group. But, the cost, I would say, is relative. When you think about good tax planning, sometimes having a professional prepare your taxes can actually save you money. I've seen people where they tried to do it themselves and then came into me and found that I could actually save them a lot more money because I knew the tax laws and I knew how to do some things that they perhaps didn't know how to do using TurboTax or something on the market.
So when you start getting into the problems people have if they don't have a professional to work with, I guess, what are some of the biggest problems that you see?
A lot of things I see are not paying attention to IRS notices, unfiled returns, obviously, we just talked about, so they haven't filed tax returns. I've seen people who haven't filed tax returns for 8-10 years. I've seen...
8 to 10 years?
Yeah. And people go, well, gee, I don't even know where to start. And fortunately, I do. We have a relationship with the IRS where we can access their databases with the right, we call it a power of attorney, so the right documentation. We have access to their databases. We can pull down transcripts, and we can literally almost recreate the documentation necessary to prepare a tax return, with the exception sometimes of businesses. Businesses, you have to, there are other measures of accomplishing sort of the same goal, but we know how to do it. And then I guess also just the regular audits and examinations. Those are the kinds of things people think of when they think of getting in trouble. And so, first of all, when you get in trouble or you're in trouble, most of the time you're just living with the fear day to day. My assurance is at one point in this process of fear, the IRS does show up. I've had IRS agents show up on new clients' doors. I say new clients because usually they then contact me.
Sure.
But
That's when the fear
it usually
becomes
does.
Real.
It does become real. But if you address the problem earlier by engaging a tax professional that's experienced with resolving these tax problems, then you can get away from some of the really nasty things that can happen.
So unfiled tax returns a big one. To your point, you remember that cartoon Robin Hood, and what is it? The sheriff comes bouncing around collecting taxes.
Yeah.
That's how I think of like an IRS agent.
I shouldn't say this, but there was one situation I was in where I was dealing with a very unruly revenue officer at the IRS. They were being very belligerent. They were being very stubborn. Really just over the top. And I did say, you're acting like the sheriff of Nottingham.
Yeah, that's who it is, the sheriff of Nottingham.
And she said, I don't appreciate that. And I said, well, I apologize, but, we're not really working effectively when you behave like this.
Oh, jeez. I'm sure she loved that. What are some other big problems that people get into?
Well, I think one of the biggest problems that surfaces from unfiled returns and ignoring the notices are what we call collection matters. And this is when the IRS actually really starts to take a very heavy hand in getting their money. So first of all, if you don't file tax returns, the IRS will actually file them for you. It's a unit called ASFR, substituted return filing, and they'll prepare the tax returns for you and then send you a bill. And at that point, I have to ask the IRS to reconsider. So I send it to a reconsideration unit. And if they reconsider it and we get an adjustment in the taxes, now all the collection matters, meanwhile, are kind of boiling over. And we have to persuade the IRS to hold off from garnishing your wages. I've had people wake up one day and find out that their bank account is gone. So they have a zero balance in their bank account, or the funds are all blocked for a few weeks. And so now I have to persuade the IRS to release funds, to release wages, to do things that they don't want to do because you've ignored them. Those are really hard situations. We know how to deal with them. But at that point in time, sometimes we can't do anything.
You know, you talk about the IRS filing tax returns for somebody. Now, I know a lot of people think they're going to be getting money back in a tax refund. Mm-hmm. Do they file it and then send a check?
No, they'll never send you a refund check on your own. You usually have to declare the tax return yourself to get a refund. And in fact, after 3 years, you actually lose your refund. So that's a strong disadvantage.
They're a little quieter, I imagine, on those ones.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are.
They don't come knocking on the door saying, hey, we owe you money.
Yeah, exactly. I think the government needs money just about as much as the rest of the economy does,
Sure.
with the exception of the Seattle real estate market.
Right. No kidding. Unless you're trying to buy a house and can't find one.
Yep.
John Miller joins us, CPA and partner with GDM Private Financial Solutions. You talked a little bit about, the unfiled tax returns and people maybe, going through that process. Are there any other really big problems that you see?
Well, I've seen a few criminal matters. At that point in time, it becomes necessary to engage an attorney, but most of the time we can resolve them right with the revenue officers themselves. I think the most challenging situations are when it becomes a collections matter, meaning they've either filed the returns or you have, and there's money owing. Now, there's two issues. One is actually filing the return. You should always file the return because that starts a number of events in place that can actually benefit you. One is the statute of limitations, right? But the second issue is really how do we then deal with the taxes involved? And that's probably an important issue to address is what do you do if you actually owe the taxes or the IRS says you owe the taxes? There are a number of solutions to resolve that and to do so in a manner that's, kind of comfortable to you.
Amicable, at least?
Kind of. It's not going to be easy. Just like if you owed people money in a debt situation, you might have to go through bankruptcy. That's not an easy thing, but it's a necessary thing sometimes. Same thing with the IRS. The IRS knows they can't get blood from a turnip, so do we. So there are provisions for, at least paying the tax.
Yeah. So what are some of those ways that you can make it palatable?
Mm-hmm. I've had people come in where they actually, they're in really difficult straits. One thing we do is we usually try to get some kind of a financial disclosure. There are a series of forms that start with the number 433. So there's 433A, B, and an AOIC. So we fill out the financial disclosure, and then that allows us to determine what the appropriate next step is. Sometimes the only possibility is, if somebody has income and assets, then they're going to have to do an installment agreement with the IRS or just pay it in full. So that's one option. Sometimes because of life's events, we can persuade the IRS in that process to abate penalties. They don't abate interest unless it's interest on penalties, but we can get them to waive the penalties if there's been, like, say, a family financial hardship, like a serious illness or something like that. But then I guess, everybody sees on TV, settle your tax debt for pennies on the dollar. My hair just kind of raises on the back of my neck when I see that stuff because most of the time I know you're dealing with people who are just ringers or salespeople for other people. For
tax masters?
Yeah. And
that guy got in a lot of trouble, didn't he?
Well, a lot of them have gotten in trouble. In fact, there's a I don't want to say her name on the radio, but there's a very famous television personality who was advertising out there. She's an attorney in California, and she got disbarred. In my mind, there's, you don't go looking for a brain surgeon by watching the TV or listening to the radio.
Sure. Unless it's our show, of course.
Yeah, unless it's our show. But, you're likely to get a referral or gain some kind of trust. Now, can you settle tax debt for pennies on the dollar? Well, I want to qualify that by saying there's a provision called a offer and compromise. So for somebody who doesn't have economic means, meaning they don't have a lot of assets or equity in their assets, and they don't have a lot of income beyond what it takes to provide a living for themselves, then we can submit an offer and compromise using 2 forms and a bunch of financial documentation like bank account statements, wage statements, and the like. We can submit that to the IRS. They look at 2 numbers. One is what we call a minimum acceptable offer. There's a financial calculation that goes in that. And then they have what's called reasonable collection potential. Now, you can imagine their number, which is reasonable collection potential, is larger than our number, which is minimum acceptable offer.
Sure.
So the art becomes, how do we bring the 2 closer and closer together and then settle for something that's less than the full amount due?
Yeah. John, we just have about a minute left, but I do want to ask this question because you brought it up. The difference, I guess, between criminal and maybe just going to collections, because I always wonder how, say like Wesley Snipes, right? The guy ends up in jail for 3 years for tax evasion versus I know, there's probably people out there who are trying to do, like, as you call it, like aggressive tax planning that maybe goes wrong. I don't know. When does something become criminal versus otherwise?
Yeah, well, there have been really, in the last week, there have been 2 huge judgments for criminal situations. In fact, some attorneys are going to jail over it. But we talk about tax evasion versus tax planning. One, tax evasion is really just breaking the laws, filing fraudulent returns, using tax shelters and not disclosing them. You're just really kind of over the top. It involves kind of more of a comprehensive knowledge of the tax laws, but those who are professionals know the line, and they should have stayed clear back behind the line. I don't know Wesley Snipes' situation. I know I've seen it in the news, but I'm not his attorney or his CPA.
He's just one of those famous people. All of a sudden, you're like, man, you got 3 years in jail. Like,
yeah.
What could you have done
right.
that garnishes 3 years in jail? I mean, it must have been a pretty large sum of money, too.
Well, here's the thing. The sooner you deal with the problem, the better. My understanding is if you have a name out there like a Wesley Snipes or you're a celebrity, it's probably a good idea to deal with it early because, they want to make examples of people.
Sure.
The best
like
examples are
57.
celebrities, right?
Yeah.
But by and large, most of the time when people are in trouble, we can deal with it. We can deal responsibly with the IRS and avoid the criminal types of situations. Where you get into criminal types of situations is when you just outright ignore it and sweep it under the carpet, hope it goes away. Those things never go away.